Hello, folks. My name is Casey. I'm a headache clinician and also a scientist here at the U. And I'm going to tell you a little story about altitude and migraine tonight. First of all, my apologies. Something has come up, and I would much rather do this live. Um, but what we'll do is we'll collect any questions, and I will do my very best to answer them. And then this will be posted to the cloud, and we can take questions sort of asymmetrically because I am curious what you all think, and I'd like to learn from you all. I'd like this to be a two-way street. So this is a Salt Lake City story. So I used to be at UCLA, but in August of 2010, I had been lured out to Salt Lake City, and we made the drive. What you see in the bottom left corner here is my old research building at UCLA, and then this is our Happy Lab building right near the Natural History Museum here in Salt Lake. And very quickly, I came to fall in love with the place. This is a view of the Salt Lake. This is our research building here. And I quickly took some ganders up in the hills above, let alone the mountains. And I came to realize, like a much more illustrious predecessor, that this really is the place. This is a wonderful place to live and work and do all of our things. Very grateful to be here. But what I started noticing, and this is the INC building that some of you all will be familiar with, is that as I started to see patients here in Salt Lake, I noticed that there was a much higher rate, at least for what I was seeing, of migraine aura, this visual hallucination that can accompany migraine. This is a pretty good depiction of it, or at least of a visual aura. There are also sensory auras of numbness and tingling. There are speech auras where you just can't find the words, even though you may understand them. And there are some other forms, but those are the most common ones. Folks were telling me that there was much more migraine aura than I would have expected based on the textbook numbers. And this is of great interest because, to me personally, because this is what we study in the lab, among other things, is the mechanism of the migraine aura is something called a spreading depolarization. It's also historically known as cortical spreading depression. But what it really is a spreading depolarization or firing of nearly all the cells in the brain, neurons, other cells as well. And what this image on the right is showing you is the spreading depolarization wave moving across the cortex, in this case of a mouse. The little structures you see, the little white things are nerve cells, neurons, and they're labeled with a dye that's genetically encoded to only express itself in neurons. And so we know we're seeing the neuronal wave moving across the field here. So suffice to say, when I heard that folks seem to have more aura than I would expect here, I got very, very curious. And so, of course, I turned to my trusty colleagues, Kathleen Degree and Susan Bagley, and I said, holy cow, there's just more aura here. What's going on? Am I insane? And they said, no, actually, you're not insane. We see many more patients here in Salt Lake with migraine aura than would be expected from the epidemiology, from the textbook, a lot more. And so that got us started on a research project that I'm going to tell you about. But in doing so, I also want to tell you about altitude and migraine a little bit. So we all know about altitude sickness, and I've got a schematic here on the left that shows you elevations with their percentage of oxygen in the air compared to sea level. And as you see, as you increase elevation, there's a decrease in the inhaled oxygen as you go up. The actual concentration of oxygen is the same, but there's fewer air molecules altogether. And so effectively, you're getting less oxygen as you rise in altitude. That's the most prominent feature of altitude, though we'll talk a little bit about how this is maybe part of it, but it may not be the whole story. Anyway, there's extremes of altitude about 9,000 meters, about the height of Everest. You're down to 30% of what you have at sea level, and above 8,000 meters, it's called the death zone, because really life is not sustainable up there for very long. But down at other altitudes, no one lives up above 8,000 meters, but plenty of people live up in this high altitude zone, and even more live in the moderate altitude zone that we live in, which is about 1,300 meters, about 4,000 to 5,000 feet here in the Salt Lake Valley. Anyway, altitude sickness is something that we all probably know about, or at least have heard about, and it can happen really starting at the level of this circle. About 2,400 meters. This is about the base at Alta or Snowbird. And we see this happen. People come up and they come from the airport, go straight up, and they feel it. And the symptoms are interesting because they sound quite familiar to you. Moderate to severe throbbing headache, nausea and vomiting, and these poorly defined visual and sensory phenomena, numbness and tingling, some hint of things that sound like aura, but really the altitude sickness researchers and the migraine researchers don't get together too much. And so, you only ask what you know. Now, altitude sickness, when it gets much more severe, has consequences that we don't typically see in migraine. Pulmonary edema, which is basically the lungs fill with fluid. Cerebral edema, the brain fills with excess fluid and basically butts up against the skull and can crush itself. It's not a pretty picture. And of course, these things can both result in death. So the red stuff is not typical of migraine, but the lead-in symptoms of altitude sickness resemble migraine quite a bit, actually. And there has been some research on the altitude, on altitude and migraine by folks concerned about migraine symptoms. And there were some studies done in the 90s at a mining site in Peru, very high up, 4,300 meters or 14,200 feet. This is about the limit of where humans can live for a long time, and it's not comfortable. This is a predominantly male population, miners, and they had 3 times the expected rate of migraine. You'd expect males to have about a 9% prevalence of migraine. That's the proportion of the population that has it at any given time. And this was 32%. As you probably know, for females, the rate is about 18% in migraine. So it's, and 2/3 of migraineurs are female. In the total population, there's about 12% of the population has migraine. As you all know, a very common disorder and understudied. Anyway, male miners have 3 times the expected rate of migraine, which is that's quite interesting. And overall headache prevalence, they might not be able to strictly define it as migraine, but the headache prevalence of 47%. And what they noted is that most of the migraine was migraine with aura. So, okay, is there some relation of both migraine and aura with altitude, in this case, very high altitude? What about more moderate elevation? So some more recent work from Nepal, which actually, it has the tallest mountains in the world, but most people in Nepal live in mountain valleys that are at relatively moderate elevation, some of them lower than us, less than 500 meters. But a lot of the population is at about 1,000 meters, so a little lower than Salt Lake again. And when they compared lower than 500 meters to greater than 1,000 meters, they saw a significant difference in migraine prevalence. And they basically were able to plot it with altitude, that there was an increase in migraine prevalence and severity above 1,000 meters. That seemed to be the threshold point, the cut point. And again, we're 1,300 meters, so that's a little bit lower than Salt Lake. Unfortunately, they collected no info on migraine aura. So that's really left to us, actually. Or actually, really, the person who spearheaded this is Zubair Ahmed, who is a headache doc now at the Cleveland Clinic. And basically, he started to collect the data that Kathleen and Susan and I had generated in our charts. This is called a chart review. So he collated what we had all seen in terms of our patient notes over time. And he got about a 54% aura prevalence, about half the folks with aura. What you'd expect is really about a third. And when we compared this with another headache clinic, this time at sea level in Seattle, we want to compare apples to apples. Folks that get seen in a headache clinic are different than folks that are out in the general population. So you want to compare headache clinic to headache clinic. And here we saw only about 16% rate of aura prevalence, actually less than what you'd expect in the general population. There's some possible reasons for that, but be that as it may, the comparison of two different headache clinics, one at altitude, one at sea level, with very similarly trained folks documenting things pretty much the same way, showed this was a very significant difference in aura prevalence. Now, there are some weaknesses to chart reviews. One, they're retrospective. Two, people do write things differently, no matter if they're similarly trained. People may not be paying attention to a given question. Maybe we're obsessed with aura and at sea level they're not. There's a number of possible things that make this relatively uncertain data. It has a lot of caveats. It may be right, but it's uncertain. And so what we then turned to was a prospective comparison. So Zubair was here with us for a year, and then sadly he left us to go back to Cleveland Clinic. We wanted to keep him here, but the silver lining of that was that he could prospectively, that means he was asking people questions at the time and following them out. He could prospectively engage about 100 consecutive patients. So he wasn't selecting them, it was just whoever came into clinic, so semi-random, here in Salt Lake and then at Cleveland, asking them exactly the same questions and not relying on recall, asking them what they knew at that time. So what did he find? Well, he found, when he compared 1,300 meters Salt Lake to 300 meters Cleveland, an aura prevalence here of 54% compared to about 36% at Cleveland, about what you'd expect in the population from the textbook. That was a very significant difference. So now we have two convergent pieces of information: our retrospective chart, well, three really, clinical anecdote, which is it carries truth, but it can be very biased. So the three of us all sort of saw this, but then when we look back and try to quantify it, so retrospective chart review, that's the second form of evidence, we saw a significant difference. And then with this much higher quality data set, this prospective collection of 100 patients in each place, we again saw the difference. So it looks like real signal here. That's what we kind of need as we build into a research question. But what could be causing this difference? And for that, you don't want to just ask about what you think might be the difference. We think it's altitude, but we could be totally wrong. And it's interesting whether or not we're right or wrong, right? So Zubair collected a lot of data in addition to the aura, whether people had aura or not at these different locations. We collected and we saw that I'm selecting a few things: age, race, religion, and body mass index, because all of these were significantly different between Salt Lake and Cleveland. And so you always want to know, are these confounders? Are these really the underlying explanation that explains the difference that we think is accounting for changes? So our Salt Lake population was slightly but significantly older than the Cleveland population, but aura doesn't tend to get more prevalent with age. You can get auras in isolation with age, but in general, it doesn't get more prevalent with age. So probably not an explanation. Race, our Salt Lake population was more white than Cleveland. There doesn't seem to be a major difference in aura prevalence or even migraine prevalence with race. Religion, there were a lot more LDS folks here. Could there be a genetic, what we call a founder effect? Was there one gene that was more concentrated, or a set of genes more concentrated in the population that made the great migration out here? It's possible, but our Salt Lake population and the group we sampled was only about half LDS versus non-LDS. And finally, body mass index. Higher body mass index does correlate with a greater aura prevalence, but higher body mass index was in Cleveland, not here. So all those things would sort of argue, well, those probably aren't factors. Uh, to top it off, we looked for any correlation between any of these variables, age, race, religion, and body mass index, and aura incidence, and there was none. So we, and also none of these were correlated with altitude in our data sample. So you see, we're sort of picking at what we think might be going on, but also looking for potential confounders, and there's more work to do. This is just a work in progress. But we're trying to sort of isolate, does aura look like it is associated with altitude and not any other confounding factors? So far, it does look like there's some signal there. And we're trying to figure this out. So this is getting into work by Kate Reinhardt that has just started. Kate's a postdoc. She's a PhD researcher, and she works on the basic mechanisms of migraine. And now that we have things that we can actually test, hypotheses that we can test, because we have things that we can really measure. You can measure altitude accurately. You can measure whether someone has an aura accurately. And we can measure the correlates of aura in our animal models. You can look at spreading depolarizations in mouse and know that that is the same event that's happening in humans. We can start testing why this might be the case. Why would altitude facilitate aura or facilitate spreading depolarizations? And so this is a grant that she just got from the NIH. And this just, I'll go very briefly into this, but that's not the main point. The main point is that, we're trying to dissect this problem. Why are we trying to dissect this problem? Because if we can get at the mechanism, we might be able to get at treatments. That's why we're doing all this. That's what this circle is, from clinic to lab, hopefully back to clinic. So our first aim, does altitude facilitate excitatory mechanisms of ST? What does that mean? Well, as you get decreased oxygen concentration in the air, your body, your cells are at a disadvantage in terms of doing all the work they need to do, mainly generating energy. And so in the extreme, when you have anoxia, no oxygen at all, basically all metabolism in all cells stops. And that we know that can be a trigger of ST. Also, hypoxia is a trigger of ST. Spreading depolarization is the mechanism of the aura. So hypoxia directly, via its effects on cellular metabolism, could directly be inducing aura with a greater likelihood, even perhaps at this only moderate elevation and moderate decrease in oxygen tension. Another possible change is that all of us, when we go up to higher altitude, grow more red blood cells. This is true even in Salt Lake. And when you grow more red blood cells, that's great. Athletes need it to carry more oxygen in the blood. We need it at altitude to carry more oxygen in the blood because we're getting less in. But everything has a catch. The catch of increased red blood cell count is that the blood is a little thicker, a little more viscous, and it clots more easily. And we know that clotting, either a clot that then dissolves or a clot that leads to a stroke, can generate spreading depolarizations. So spreading depolarizations aren't just active in migraine aura, they're part of stroke, part of traumatic brain injury. They're a manifestation of brain excitability that's as important as epilepsy. It's just we know more about epilepsy. So anyway, you could get clotting with an increased tendency to clotting with altitude. Clotting that may or may not lead to strokes. It's this, most people with migraine don't have strokes. Though there is a relationship, and that's a whole nother story that we can talk about another day. It's mainly reassuring, so no need to worry about it right now. But we have two competing hypotheses that actually might be interrelated about how aura is generated by altitude. One is hypoxia, there's less oxygen around. The other is there's more red blood cells making the blood a little sludgier and making clotting more likely. And Kate can test these in the lab with mice. And how does she do that? Well, what you see down at the bottom is we have little tiny altitude chambers. They kind of are pressure cookers. we have one that has increased pressure because we're testing sea level, so we have to increase the pressure in it. We have one that's basically open, that's at our elevation here, moderate altitude, and then we have one where it's a vacuum where we suck the air out to simulate 4,000 meters of altitude, which is pretty high. And so these experiments are ongoing. We've got our mice in their little chambers, and we've got little cameras on their heads taking images, and then they're doing behavior work. We're testing whether they have more photophobia, just like we can test in humans at altitude. So we're doing all sorts of things, and we don't have the answers yet. But the main point is, you see that we're taking something that we saw here in Salt Lake, and we're trying to make hay out of it. We're trying to generate new treatments, right? And so hopefully this is a little quite local, quite personal example of how the research process works. And hopefully you also got a brief update on headache with altitude. The similarities, very striking similarities with acute mountain sickness. A very strong signal that headache burden, migraine or otherwise, increases with both moderate and high altitude. That's been shown. And then a strong signal that very high altitude very much increases the aura burden. And then some developing evidence from here that this is true at our moderate elevation. And hopefully I'll have more to tell you about that as we can dive into the mechanisms, because again, it's those mechanisms that could get us to new treatments that might make life better for everyone who lives at a moderate elevation, to improve their migraine auras and maybe improve their migraines in general. If you can make auras better, you can make the migraines better. And then on a more care-centered note, some tips. If you think you have altitude-associated aura, this is an important part of your headaches, right? It's something we should be treating. So definitely log the frequency. Do take a diary. Note if it's an aura, that if the auras are increased, or if just headaches are increased along with the auras, or both. Try to get a pattern. Try to see if there's any change when you go up to higher elevations, down to lower elevations, and then let us know. We can help. We can. There are already clues to treatments that we can use based on some of the characteristics of the data. So we can actually probably, even based on what we know already, make a difference. And I think I will leave it at that. So thank you all for listening, and hopefully we'll be able to take some questions very soon online virtually. Thanks.